Hi again, everyone. From Cedar Rapids, I'm Bob Ask with my continuing story. My life in the context of American history. History that I studied, history that I taught as a career, and history as I lived. Now, 94 years plus. Today, my subject, vignette number 14, is entitled Her Roots, Marilyn's Story. One that she was so proud of, her heritage that she loved, and it is a big-time story, as you'll see, no wonder, and that she shared and loved to tell about, I suppose, more often than we wanted to hear. We heard a lot about this story that Marilyn was so proud of. I'm sure that she is happy that now I can relate parts of her story. Notice I put that in the present tense. I think she's happy that we're sharing it. I wish now that I had listened maybe a little closer on some of the details, because now I wish I could ask her, hey, how about that? Or can you correct or clarify that point in her story? But I heard enough, and I've studied enough since her records and her detailed material that I can come up with a decent story about Marilyn's wonderful family background. In fact, in my search, I found out some things about her heritage that she didn't know about, that she would be so happy to know, and now she gets to see it too, some things that she didn't even know about. For this trip through her background, I put together this little family tree. It shows her roots on the left, her paternal side, the Reeds, and over at your right, the maternal sides, going back to her mother, the Cattersons. And notice in this family tree, I've numbered 1, 2, 3, 4 stops that we're going to point out big things were happening in what I call a truly Americana story of history. Up there in step number 1, her roots go back to the War for Independence. In stop number 2, moving over to her great-grandfather, we come to the Civil War, some stories. In stop number 3, to her grandfather, her beloved grandfather, we come to step number 3, he, the cowboy. And then over here on the other side, Grandpa Catterson, who lived alongside Old Man River and made his career on the Mississippi. What a story. 4 stops. Well, way back in 1733, 4 decades prior to the Revolution, King George of England gave rights to provide ferry service to Emmanuel Corral. Marilyn's story that goes back to the 1730s. He was given rights over in America to provide ferry service, with rights starting on the Delaware River on the New Jersey side that soon enveloped Pennsylvania across the way. So Correll's Ferry was the name of a settlement that spread out on both sides of the Delaware, New Jersey, and to the west, Pennsylvania. Now, moving down, his son, George Correll, becomes the star of our story. He and his brother in the 1770s operated a famous ferry boat service across the river. Now, we should point out early that there were other ferry boat services across the Delaware too, but this became the most famous by far. We should also point out that this was before bridges, of course. Bridges didn't come along until the early 1800s. So travel from north to south, this was a main artery of travel and transportation. They had to use the ferry service across the river. And we should point out also that all of this activity that I'm going to tell you about happened within an hour of travel nowadays north of Philadelphia. So you can kind of see where we are. Now, how does it become famous? George Washington crossed the Delaware River 2 times on George's ferry service. The first one, the famous one, depicted in that crossing of the Delaware picture and painting, Marilyn knew all about. The second one, I researched and found out that came along a little later. The first crossing came in Christmas Day, 1776, when Washington's troops that had been stationed on the Pennsylvania side all winter, spring, fall, winter, up to Christmas, now made their move against the British. Washington's army, on a bad, stormy Christmas Day evening, with thousands of troops and using other ferry boats as well, moved across the river and then down the New Jersey side to the Battle of Trenton. Easily conquered, the Hessian soldiers, German soldiers hired by the British to fight, gave up without too many casualties. The famous The Crossing, 1776. 2 years later, Washington's army was encamped a short distance west of Philadelphia at the famous place Valley Forge. In June of 78, he moved his troops north to Correll's Ferry, paused there, crossed the Delaware, and went on eastward to win against Cornwallis the Battle of Monmouth. We could point out 3 other little aspects of the Correll story there way back in the late 1700s. One of the officers in Washington's army there all that time in that settlement, that town with an inn and all, was later President John Monroe. They say Monroe was a very friendly guy, got to know the people, and for years later would come back and visit and know those people. The lieutenant became President Monroe. He was there. George Carell may have had a chat with him, who knows. We should also point out that those Hessian soldiers were taken, all of them, back across the ferry, a couple thousand of them, all the way back to Philadelphia, where they were finally released, treated well, and guess what? A lot of them stayed in America. Good thinking. George Carell himself knew George Washington. We know that because after the war, he moved to Alexandria, Virginia, near Mount Vernon, and was in George Washington's same lodge. When Washington died, George Carell, Marilyn's forebearer, was a pallbearer at his funeral. Step 2, quickly, Marilyn's great-grandfather, Thomas Reed, had 4 siblings in the Civil War. 3 of them are buried at Klein Cemetery, north of Muscatine, north of Marilyn's farm. All buried Civil War veterans and who died in the war. One of them buried, the 4th one, at Vicksburg. They are buried in north of Muscatine. So, as a family, we've made many trips to see those tombstones, those graves. Mother's connection to the Civil War. Where, by the way, Muscatine enlistees took off for the war from that little town, Moscow, just north of Klein Cemetery. Our 3rd stop in Marilyn's trip Americana features her grandfather, Charles Reed. As a young man with his bride, he became a homesteader out in northeast Colorado near Durango. Tried to live in a stud house and get a living going. Found it difficult. Ended up in Denver, where he was employed by the famous H.A.W. Tabor, the Silver King, in a mansion. He worked for the Tabors. Mr. Tabor eventually married again in a fabulous wedding in Washington, D.C. He was that rich and that well known to a young, beautiful girl named Baby Doe. Why, no women would go to the wedding. President Arthur was there. Women would not go because she had taken over Tabor's life. Well, anyway, for the grandpa, one day, tending the fire in the mansion, a spark caught on to the carpeting. He was fired for that little problem. He ended up in Muscatine, in Marilyn's house, the beloved grandfather that she cherished so much. As far as Baby Doe is concerned, after the magnate himself, the Silver King, died, she refused to give up the matchless mine near Leadville. even though when it was long gone, and finally died a recluse, not even enough income to have good shoes on those winter days. Baby Doe Tabor never gave up the matchless mine, and such a story that it became a Broadway hit. Marilyn's Connection again. And then moving over to the other side of the family tree, Andrew Catterson, her grandpa, lived in Muscatine with Grandma Bessie. Now, let me tell you something about Muscatine. For a long period of time, the 1890s to the 1930s, Muscatine was the pearl button capital of the entire world. The shells in the Mississippi River. Grandpa Andrew and Bessie in a boat living off an island would be one of the many, many clamshell diggers that would translate into the factory nearby where he eventually worked for the pearl buttons that later on went out of style. Why? The zipper and plastic buttons. Famous Muscatine and Marilyn's family once again. Well, as a wrap up, let me just say this. Marilyn was always so proud of her background, and our kids, Jerry and Shelley, worked out a DNA test just to see really where did those immigrants come from to America. And Marilyn found out that 83% from England, Wales, and Northwest Europe, because Marilyn always knew there were connections somehow to the Huguenots. 15% Ireland and Scotland. She was surprised. She thought she had more Scotch blood in her than it turned out. And here's the hooker. 2% Norwegian. Marilyn always wondered, where did that Norwegian figure in? Marilyn's story, I call it Americana.